It's the year 1801. Napoleon had just received intel about the British plans to expand their naval fleet in response to his economic blockade on Britain. This meant the French coastlines were at stake. But Napoleon had one particular location in mind: the coasts of Oleron and Ré Islands, whose defenses were known to be weak. Napoleon instructs his engineers to come up with a fortress right in the middle of the ocean. The fortress needs to be unbreakable against the fierce waves of the Atlantic and British battleships. Months later, the much-anticipated blueprints came back, detailing one of the most unique projects in military architecture history, an engineering masterpiece defying the laws of nature. However, the French didn't know that this fortress would become the hardest task they had ever faced. How did it come to life? And how effective was it against the scary fleets of the British Empire? We modeled the entire thing to show you exactly that. This is a look inside one of the most famous military monuments in French history. This is Fort Boyard. By the year 1800, the political landscape between France and Britain was marked by high tensions and ongoing conflicts, primarily from the French Revolutionary Wars and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Following the French Revolution of 1789, Britain viewed the revolutionary French government as a direct threat. In response, Britain formed coalitions against France, leading to a series of wars. By 1800, the Second Coalition was in effect, uniting Britain, Austria, Russia, and other European powers against French expansion. Napoleon needed strong defense mechanisms against European efforts to bring him down. That's when the idea of Fort Boyard came about. But the construction of Fort Boyard wasn't a new idea at the time. In fact, Napoleon knew about previous attempts by Louis XIV. Even great French military engineer Vauban himself declared that he was incapable of overcoming this challenge. As he once said to Louis XIV, "It would be easier to seize the moon in my teeth than to attempt such a task in this location." But Napoleon was determined. In 1803, his attempt to make this project a reality began. The construction site was located in a strategically significant yet challenging location between the islands of Oleron and Ré, along the western coast of France. Since gunners couldn't reach the center of the pathway between the two islands, the fort needed to be centered right in the middle. This area is known for its treacherous waters, strong currents, and unpredictable weather conditions, which made construction both difficult and dangerous. Since the fort needed to be built in water, everything had to be adjusted. The logistics were a complete nightmare for the crew. Workers could only work on the project during low tide. They were forced to transport materials like granite and limestone to the remote site in small boats that could drown at any moment. Not only that, maintaining a consistent work schedule was almost impossible. From the get-go, it was clear that building this project was even harder than anyone had imagined. In 1804, the crew started the first and the hardest phase of the whole project, building the base. This meant transporting 10,000 tons of stone blocks, the equivalent to 450 semi-trucks, and dumping them in the water. At low tide, workers come to unload so that they can arrange these blocks of stone, move them, and ensure that they are well organized. At high tide, the blocks of stone get immersed, reaching the sandy bottom. The following year, another 50 tons of stone blocks were placed on top of the others. Finally, a compact, stable base emerged on the surface. However, things quickly went south when the blocks that made it up were swept away like dust during a storm in October of 1806. Under pressure from the English, logistics witnessed considerable delays. Means were lacking, and some boats sank with their cargo and crew before even reaching the shipyard. The crew had to start all over again each time. The blocks of stone that arrived at the top, when they'd come back the next time, it would be sunk at the bottom again. Having a boss called Napoleon at the time didn't help either. Many of the engineers and project managers quickly resigned from pressure, and the odds of Fort Boyard becoming a reality began to shrink. In August 1808, Napoleon came in person to check the reasons behind the delays. Following advice from his engineers, he accepts the reduction in size of the fort to approximately half. On the other hand, he approves of the general architecture of the project. A fort that looks like a warship of approximately 74 cannons, a vessel with 3 decks, and an upper deck on which he would also have artillery. The overall shape is slightly elongated with both ends rounded, a design that's never been seen before. In the spring of 1809, construction resumed. But just when Napoleon's hopes were high, terrible news came back from the site. On April 1st the same year, 2 English ships surprised the workers engaged on the Fort Boyard site. They easily managed to chase the crew away and ransack the construction site. As expected, the French cannons on the island of Aix and Pointe de Saumonard were powerless to reach them, but the worst is yet to come. On April 11th, Just 10 days later, 76 ships flying English flags approached the island of Aix and anchored on the Boyard Longe. Opposite, the French only lined up 12 ships. The English loaded 50 ships with explosives and launched them straight at the French fleet, destroying everything in minutes. Following this major disappointment, Napoleon decided to postpone the construction of Fort Boyard indefinitely. After 3.5 million francs wasted, the equivalent to $7 million in today's money, Fort Boyard seemed impossible to build, until another French ruler decided to go against all odds and challenge nature one more time. And that ruler was Louis Philippe, called by the French the King of the People. Fascinated by Fort Boyard's architectural sketches, he insisted on building the fort no matter how much it would cost. In the middle of the 19th century, an event favored the progress of work on Fort Boyard, the Industrial Revolution. The site reopened its doors in 1841. There was still a stock of cut stones beaten by the waves. Thanks to technological advancements, hydrographic engineers became capable of creating very precise maps, which allowed them to realize that the artificial stone platform which was built in 1809 had sunk, which wasn't surprising due to the sandy nature of France's coast. The platform had sank 1.5 meters below the previous measurements from 30 years ago. Builders have to restart the process all over again. First, they must flatten the surface of the platform, then build 1-meter-high walls using canvas bags, filled with hydraulic cement forming different boxes. After that, these 8 cubic meter boxes would get filled with concrete and hydraulic lime and covered with quick-setting cement. They then needed to reinforce this structure with a belt of enormous stone blocks, measuring 15 cubic meters, and finally build a cut stone base up to 2 meters above sea level. The whole base of the project must measure 65 meters long and 35 meters wide. A close-by factory was set up in Boyardville to host 300 workers. We are now starting this alternation again. Immersion of blocks at high tide and transport of workers at low tide to organize the stones and then pour the mortar. A couple of years later, the base was finally ready. It was time to move to the next phase of construction. Designed as a warship, Fort Boyard will have to be able to operate in complete autonomy. The basement would hold 3 rainwater tanks with a capacity of 325,000 liters, as well as 13 storage units. The ground floor would be reserved for 22 casemates in which cannons would be placed, offices, a kitchen, and prison cells for war hostages. The first and second floor will be mainly reserved for 44 cannons covering the 360-degree angle of the fort. And finally, at the top of the fort, a terrace was designed as a real shooting platform for the 1836mm cannons that would be eventually installed on pivot rails. The highest point of the building would be a watchtower built at 29 meters high. The outside walls would be made of extremely hard crozan stone, over 2 meters thick to be able to resist the enormous pressure of storm waves. And the final touch, a long staircase plunging into the sea, providing access to the building. The ground floor was completed at the end of 1852, 1854, and 1857. The much-anticipated Fort Boyard is now officially ready. However, things didn't quite go as planned afterwards for the French. The same reasons that made Fort Boyard's construction possible also made it kinda useless. Fort Boyard became largely obsolete due to significant advancements in military artillery during the mid-19th century. The introduction of rifled cannons provided greater range and accuracy, allowing attackers to penetrate thick walls. Breech-loading guns enabled quicker reload times and more powerful shells, while high-explosive and shrapnel shells increased destructive power, incapacitating defenders within the fort. Not only that, the emergence of ironclad warships allowed naval forces to effectively bombard coastal fortifications, making static defenses like Fort Boyard extremely vulnerable. As military strategies evolved towards more mobile tactics, the fort's significance diminished, leading to its abandonment and the association with being the useless fort in French circles. Just a little over a decade from its inauguration, the whole purpose of the fort shifted from a defense mechanism to a military prison and was abandoned altogether in 1871. The fort that took a century to build would also remain abandoned for a whole century, but one man managed to bring the fort back from the dead. On a beautiful afternoon in 1967, Jacques Antoine, a French radio and TV personality, decides to go to the movies to see the new film by Robert Enrico called The Adventurers. The film relates the story of 2 fellow adventurers setting out in search of a sunken treasure off the coast of the Congo. The last third of the film takes place on the Aix Island off the western coast of France. The character of the adventurer buys an old abandoned fort. It is located in the open sea close to the small island. Its silhouette is recognizable from afar. That silhouette is Fort Boyard. Inspired by the movie, Jacques-Antoine purchases the fort and decides to produce a game show called Treasure Hunting, where candidates find clues in order to win a money prize at the end. After becoming a big hit in the 80s, the show was rebranded to be renamed Fort Boyard. Season after season, the popularity of the episodes grew, reaching record numbers, and multiple foreign TV networks purchased the rights to the show. The once called The Useless Fort has become the scene of the most popular game show in French television history. Subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.